His name was Mr. Anton Keller. They made him come in through the servants' door. 9 shillings a week they paid him. They gave him the cold rooms above the stable, where the horse's breath rose through the floorboards at night. He was the music master, and he was foreign, and his single black coat had a frayed cuff he never let anyone see. He bowed, he said nothing, he did not flinch, and it grew worse. At a dinner before 40 guests, Lady Farleigh looked down the length of her table and said, "Play something, foreign man, and be grateful we feed you at all." She had his chair carried out from the supper, so he would eat standing, in the passage, with the maids. And the whole room laughed. But that same night, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar was to arrive as guest of honour, and there was something sewn into the lining of that shabby coat, a coat that plain Clara Ainsworth had quietly mended one winter, feeling a hard little shape beneath the wool and saying nothing of it. Something small, something that would bring a duchess to her knees. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe so a story like this never passes you by. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me take you to Yorkshire. Harrowgate Hall stood on a rise above the town of Thornby in the year 1868. It was a great grey house with too many windows and not enough coal to warm them. From the road it looked like wealth. Up close, you could see the paint peeling on the north face, and the gardens gone a little wild at the edges, and the way the family clung to a name that no longer had the money to match it. Clara Ainsworth knew every cold corner of that house. She was 22. She was an orphan and dowerless, and she was the niece of the master who had died 3 years back, which made her, in Lady Farleigh's arithmetic, a charity kept on out of Christian duty and worked like a maid to earn her keep. She rose before the fires were lit. She carried the linens, she counted the silver and mended the torn hems, and read to Lady Farleigh in the evenings until her own eyes ached. And at supper, when the family sat, Clara sat below the salt, that old cruel line at the table that marked who mattered and who did not. She sat where the servants sat. She had learned to be quiet the way some girls learn to sew. Small stitches. No noise. Clara had dark brown hair that she parted down the centre and pinned plain, because plainness drew no eyes, and drawing no eyes was safest. She had deep green eyes she mostly kept lowered, and she had a mouth that had learned not to say what it thought, a quiet, resolute mouth that pressed itself flat when Augusta laughed at her gown, or when Lady Farleigh called her girl as though she had no name at all. She had been told in 100 small ways that she was worth nothing, and the terrible thing was, she had come to believe it. The music master arrived on a grey Tuesday in the spring. Clara was the one who opened the door to him, because she was always the one sent to open doors. He stood on the step with the rain coming down, one leather case in his hand, that single black coat buttoned to the throat. He was perhaps 30. He had a still face, and dark eyes that took in the whole hall in one quiet sweep and gave nothing back. When Clara said, "You're expected. This way, please," he inclined his head, just so. A small, exact bow. She had never seen a poor man bow like that. She did not know yet what it meant. "Mr. Keller," Lady Farleigh said, when he was shown into the morning room. She did not rise. She looked him over the way a woman looks over a horse she suspects has been overpriced. "You come recommended, though I can't think by whom. You'll polish my daughter's playing for the season. She is to be presented at the summer ball, and her music must be passable. You'll take your meals apart from the family. 9 shillings the week. That is generous, given your circumstances." "You are most kind, madam," he said. His accent was soft and foreign, and Clara could not have named the country of it. He did not argue the wage. He did not ask for a fire. He only bowed again and said he would begin whenever the young lady wished. Augusta Farleigh swept in a moment later, 20 years old, gold-haired and beautiful in the way that a knife is beautiful. She looked at the music master's frayed cuff and his worn boots, and she smiled the smile she kept for people beneath her. "So this is the tutor," she said to her mother, as if he were not standing there. "He looks like something the parish turned out. Well, sit down, foreign man, and let's see if you're worth even 9 shillings. He sat at the pianoforte. And here, on the very first day, was the first thing the household should have noticed, and did not. He did not sit like a servant. He settled onto the bench with a straightness in his spine that no cringing migger ever owned, shoulders squared, chin level, hands laid on the keys the way a man lays his hands on something that has always been his. For one breath, before he began, he looked less like a tutor come begging for 9 shillings and more like a man at the head of a room he had commanded 100 times. Then the moment passed, and he was only the music master again, and Augusta was already tapping her foot with impatience. He played, and even Augusta went quiet. It was not a showy piece. It was a waltz, slow and turning, and terribly sad underneath its grace, the kind of music that seems to remember something. "That is a waltz of my own country," he said softly, when it was done. He did not name the country. He only lifted his hands from the keys and folded them in his lap. Clara, who had lingered in the doorway with a stack of linen going cold in her arms, felt something ache in her chest that she could not have explained. She thought, whoever he is not what they think. She did not know how right she was. Nobody in that house did. The tune had a name a duchess would speak aloud months from now in a room full of 40 people. But that was still a long way off. In the weeks that followed, Clara watched the household do to the music master exactly what the household did to everyone it decided did not matter. They fed him in the passage, a plate handed out to him in the cold corridor between the kitchen and the yard, to be eaten standing, while the family dined on the good china within. They mocked his accent. Augusta had a way of repeating his words back to him, with the vowels twisted cruel, and laughing, and looking to her mother to laugh too. When the spring turned wet and bitter, they denied him a fire in his rooms above the stable, though Clara knew for a fact there was coal enough in the cellar, because she was the one who counted it. And he took it. That was the thing that Clara could not understand. He took all of it with that same still face and that same exact little bow, as though the insults were rain and he was a man long used to standing out in weather. Only once did she see the mask slip. She had gone out to the stable with a candle one evening on some errand of Lady Farleigh's, and through the gap in his door she saw him sitting on the edge of his narrow cot with his head bowed and his hands loose between his knees, and on his face was a grief so large and so old that she stepped back into the dark, ashamed to have seen it. It was not the grief of a poor man cheated of a fire. It was the grief of a man who had lost something enormous. She went away and said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. She should tell you now about the coat, because the coat is the whole of it, though neither of them knew that yet. It had happened the winter before he came. No, that is not right. Let me tell it plain. It happened that winter, his first winter at the Hall. The wind came down off the moor and got into every crack of the stable rooms, and one grey afternoon Clara found the music master's coat left over the back of a kitchen chair to dry, and she saw the lining had torn along the seam and the cold would be getting straight through to him. So she did what she always did. She fixed it. She took her needle and her small quiet stitches and she turned the lining back to mend it, and that was when her fingers found it. A hard little shape, sewn deep into the wool, low in the lining, where a man might hide a thing he could not bear to lose. Round and heavy for its size, like a coin, or a seal. She pressed it once through the cloth and felt the raised pattern on its face, and she thought, a keepsake, some coin from home, some token of a family or a country he'd left behind. It was not her business. A poor man's secrets were the only wealth he had, and she would not be the one to strip them from him. So she sewed the lining closed over it, snug and warm, with the little coins safe inside, and she left the coat on the chair to dry, and she said not one word to anyone. She had no notion, none in the world, that she had just sewn a crown back into the dark. When he found the coat mended, he asked the cook who had done it, and the cook said, "Miss Clara, most like. She mends what wants mending and never says." And the music master went very still, and then he did a curious thing. He sought Clara out in the still room where she was setting jars, and he stood in the doorway and said, "You mended my coat." "It was torn," she said, not looking up. "It was letting the cold in. It was nothing." "It was not nothing," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her lift her eyes to him. He was looking at her the way no one in that house had ever looked at her. Not down, not past, at her, as though she were a person, and not a piece of the furniture that fetched and carried. "Thank you, Miss Ainsworth," he said, and he bowed, that small exact bow, and it was the first time in 3 years that anyone had bowed to Clara Ainsworth, and she did not know what to do with her hands. That was the beginning of it. Neither of them would have called it anything. But it began there, over a torn seam and a coin that was not a coin. Lady Farleigh, of course, saw none of this. What Lady Farleigh saw was money, and the lack of it, and the terrible arithmetic that was closing in on Harrowgate Hall. She measured every soul who came through her door by what it was worth to her, and by that measure the music master was worth 9 shillings, and her niece was worth rather less. She could not have told you the colour of Clara's eyes. She had never once looked. And then there was the first real cruelty, the wage. It came over a small thing, as these things do. One afternoon Augusta was murdering a passage at the pianoforte, striking the same wrong note again and again, and the music master said, "Gently, if I may, miss, the note is here, not there," and reached to show her. Augusta snatched her hand away as though he had burned her. "Don't you touch the keys after me," she snapped. "Don't you correct me, you beggar with a fiddle." And she went straight to her mother and said the tutor had been insolent, had laid hands on her, had forgotten his place. Lady Farleigh sent for him. She did not ask what had happened. "You will remember," she said, in that flat, cold voice of hers, "that you are here on my sufferance and my daughter's patience, and that a man in your position corrects nothing and no one. I shall dock you 2 shillings this week for your insolence. Be grateful it is not the whole. 2 shillings from 9. Clara, who happened to be in the room with the mending, saw his jaw tighten. Just once. Just for a breath. 2 shillings was near a quarter of everything he had, taken for the crime of knowing the right note better than the girl he was paid to teach. And still he only bowed and said, "As you wish, madam," and went out. But Clara had seen the jaw, and she thought, again, he is not what they think. What is he that he can swallow this? What kind of man carries a grief that size and takes a beating for a shilling and bows? She did not know. But she was beginning, very quietly, to want to. The offences gathered like weather. And then came the music evening, the night the household's contempt stood up in front of 40 people and showed its whole face. It was the loudest, ugliest thing Clara ever saw done in that house, and I want you to see it the way she saw it. Lady Farleigh had guests, neighbours of rank, a scattering of the county's better families, all invited so that Augusta might be shown off before the season proper began, for the whole desperate plan of the household rested on Augusta making a great marriage, and quickly. There was to be music after supper, and Augusta was to play. What Augusta played that night was not Augusta's. In the weeks of lessons, the music master had been writing something. Clara had heard fragments of it drifting from the music room, a piece of his own, grave and lovely, and he had set some of it down on paper to teach the fingering of a difficult passage. Augusta had taken those pages, and now she sat at the pianoforte before the county and played his composition as her own, and when she stumbled, the music master, standing quietly against the wall where the hired men stood, said, softly, only meaning to help, the second phrase rises, "Miss, the room went still." Lady Farleigh turned, and in front of every guest, in a voice pitched to carry, she said, "Did the tutor speak? Did the hired thing open its mouth in my drawing-room?" She let the silence do its work. Then she smiled. "Since you are so eager to be heard, Mr. Keller, you shall be heard all evening. Go and stand in the corner there and play for the dancing. That is what you are for. Play like the hired thing you are, and do not stop until my guests are tired of dancing." And the room, the whole soft, well-bred room, laughed. He went to the corner. He sat at the little upright there, in the draught by the window, and he played for them to dance. Country dances, waltzes, whatever they called for, hour on hour, while the fine people turned and turned across the floor and never once looked at the man making the music they moved to. His back was very straight. His face gave nothing. And Clara, watching from the doorway with a tray, felt something in her turnover, a hot choking thing she had no name for, because girls seated below the salt are not permitted anger. She could not bear it. She filled a glass with water, and she crossed the edge of the room to bring it to him, because his hands had been playing for 2 hours and no one had thought to give him so much as a cup, and she reached him. And she held it out, and for one moment his eyes met hers, and something passed between them, some silent thing, gratitude and shame and a strange, fierce dignity all at once. And then Augusta struck it from her hand. She did it laughing. She swept past and knocked the glass from Clara's fingers, so it shattered on the boards and the water went dark across the wood, and she said, loud, for the guests, "The servants water the beast now, do they?" How touching. "Fetch a cloth, Clara, and clean up your mess." And the room laughed again, at Clara this time, at the plain charity niece on her knees, mopping water and glass, while the music never stopped. Because he had not stopped playing, he played straight through it, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and only Clara, close as she was, saw the single muscle move in his throat as he watched her humiliated on the floor at his feet, and could do nothing. Nothing, without making it worse for her. That was the low point. That was the bottom of the first half of it. I promise you the bottom is where it turns. Because something changed in the music master after that night. The stillness was the same. But underneath the stillness, something had set, like water going to ice. He had watched them put Clara on her knees to protect his pride, and Clara had brought him water when 40 people would not. And a man can carry a great deal of his own suffering and still break at the sight of another's. He had made a decision. He did not announce it. Men like him never announce anything. But it was made. The lessons with Augusta went on, sullen and thankless. But now there were other lessons, ones the household knew nothing of. In the early mornings, before the fires and the fetching, when Harrowgate Hall still slept, the music master would be in the empty music room, and Clara, who also rose before everyone, began to find reasons to be near it. And one grey dawn he simply said, through the open door, "Do you play, Miss Ainsworth?" "No," she said. "I was never taught." "Come and sit then," he said. "I have an hour and no pupil in it. I would rather spend it well." And so he taught her. For nothing, for less than nothing, for she had not a penny to pay, and he had 9 shillings a week, minus whatever they chose to dock him. He taught her the way a real master teaches, patient and exact, his hands guiding hers on the keys, and in those stolen hours, something in Clara that had been folded small for 3 years began, very slowly, to open. She had a gift. He told her so, plainly, the way he told her the truth about everything, that she heard the music truly, that her hands were quick, that she had been made to believe she was nothing by people who could not tell gold from brass. When he said things like that, she had to look down, because her eyes stung, and she was not used to kindness and did not know how to receive it without weeping. One of those mornings he stopped playing and looked out the window at the wild spring garden, and he said, so quietly she almost missed it, "There was a garden, where I come from, above a river. My mother's roses grew there." He was silent a moment. "I used to think I would show it to someone. One day." "Will you go back?" Clara asked. "To your country?" Something crossed his face, that old enormous grief, and he said only, "That is not for a music master to say." And he began to play again. But Clara heard it. That grief was too large for a poor tutor. Servants do not mourn gardens above rivers as though they were thrones they had lost. She filed it away with the coin sewn in his coat, and the bow no beggar owned, and the note he could name better than his betters. The pieces were gathering. She did not yet see the shape they made. But she was closer than anyone in that house. There came, around this time, a small thing that Clara would remember later and understand. A visiting officer called at the hall, some acquaintance of the family, in his regimentals, all polish and heel clicks, and as he made his bow in the hall he did it wrongly, some small error of form, and the music master, passing through with his case, said, without thinking, purely by reflex, the way a man corrects a thing he has known all his life, a phrase of address in a cool, precise, commanding tone, naming the correct form. The officer turned, startled, and for half a breath something like recognition and confusion crossed his face, as if a tutor had just corrected the etiquette of a court he had no business knowing. Then the music master lowered his eyes and was the tutor again, and murmured a beggar's apology and went on. But Clara had seen the officer's face, and she thought, what tutor knows the manners of a court well enough to correct a soldier by reflex? The question sat in her like a stone. And then the household's private terror came walking up the drive in a black coat, and everything else was swallowed by it. His name was Mr. Crane, of the banking house of Ledbury and Crane, and he came on a fine afternoon with papers in a leather folder, and he was closeted with Lady Farleigh for the better part of an hour behind the library door. Clara, passing with the tea, heard the figures through the wood, because Mr. Crane had the kind of voice that does not trouble to lower itself when it is delivering a sentence. £9,300. That was the sum owed on Harrowgate Hall, borrowed against the estate in the years since the master died, when the money went out faster than it came in, and the name had to be propped up with borrowed gold. £9,300, and Ledbury and Crane wanted it. 60 days, Mr. Crane said, in that flat voice. 60 days to bring the debt current, or the bank would foreclose. And Harrowgate Hall, and its lands, and its grey stone, and its too many windows, would pass out of Farleigh hands forever. Clara stood in the passage with the tea going cold in her hands, and understood, all at once, everything, the desperate pushing of Augusta into the season, the 40 guests, the whole frantic machinery of the house. It was not vanity, or not only vanity, it was drowning. Lady Farleigh was trying to marry her daughter to money before the 60 days ran out, because a rich son-in-law was the only thing on God's earth that could save Harrowgate now, and the richest fish in the county was a Lord Bramwell, a smooth, well-dressed gentleman with an eye for the Farleigh name and no great fortune of his own that anyone could name, though he wore his coats as if he had one. Augusta must land Lord Bramwell at the summer ball. There was no other rope. The clock had started, and it was ticking down toward the ruin of them all. That evening Clara found the music master in the music room and, hardly knowing why, told him. All of it. The £9,300, the 60 days, the bank, the ball, the whole cold shape of the thing. She did not know why she told him he was as poor as she was, poorer. He could do nothing, except that he was the only person in her life who listened when she spoke, and it had grown too heavy to carry alone. He listened. He did not seem surprised exactly. He seemed, Clara thought, like a man watching a tide he had always known would come. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "So there is to be a great ball, and everything hangs upon it." He looked at her. "And what becomes of you, Miss Ainsworth, if the house falls? Where does the charity niece go when there is no house left to be charitable?" She had not let herself think of it. "I don't know," she said. "Nowhere. I have nowhere." He was silent again, and there was something in his face she could not read, some struggle, some weighing of a thing far heavier than she understood. For the music master had a secret larger than the coin in his coat, larger than the grief in his eyes, and it had just begun to press him toward a choice. But he only said, at last, "Then we had best make certain that when the great night comes, they cannot fail to see you." He set his hands on the keys. "There is a piece I would teach you, if you will learn it, so that on the night of the ball, when they are all watching Augusta, one of them at least might look, for once, at you." Clara did not understand what he meant to risk by it. She could not have. She only knew that a poor foreign man with a docked wage and a torn coat had just promised to teach her, for nothing, the thing that might let her be seen, and that in 3 years at Harrowgate Hall. No one else had offered her a single thing they did not first count the cost of. What she did not know, what none of them knew, as the spring turned toward the summer and the invitations to the great ball went out across the county, was that a letter was already on its way to Harrowgate. A letter carried by a foreign hand, sealed and secret, addressed to a music master no one respected. A letter that would tell him the tide had finally turned in a country 1,000 miles away. A letter that would force the quietest man in Yorkshire to choose, at last, between the secret that kept him safe and the girl who had mended his coat without ever guessing what she had sewn into the dark. The coin was still there, in the lining, warm against him. The ball was coming, and a duchess, who had not yet arrived, was going to walk into that drawing-room, hear a certain sad and turning waltz, and stop dead in the middle of the floor. But that is the second half of the story, and you are going to want to be here for it. The letter came on a Tuesday. It came in the hand of a man Clara had never seen, a traveller in a mud-spattered cloak who asked at the kitchen door for the music master and would give no name. Cook thought him a debt collector. She fetched Keller down from the stable rooms with a sour word, and Clara, passing in the passage with an armful of linen, saw the stranger press the sealed thing into the tutor's hands and murmur something low in a tongue she did not know. She saw the music master's face go still, not surprised, still the way a pond goes, still just before the ice takes it. He read it in the cold light of the passage window. His lips did not move. But his hand, the one holding the paper, began to tremble, and he closed it into a fist to make it stop. Then he thanked the stranger, quietly, and the stranger did a thing that made no sense at all to Clara. He bowed, not the bow of a servant, the bow of a man who has just been given leave to go. That night Clara could not sleep. She had seen a great many strange things in 3 years at Harrowgate Hall, but none stranger than a traveller bowing to a man who ate his supper in a draughty passage for 9 shillings a week. She did not know what the letter said. I will tell you, because he never would. It said the regent was dying, the man who had taken Anton's country by force, who had driven a boy prince across 1,000 miles of border and mountain, who had put a price on his head that stood to this very day. That man was dying at last, and the loyalists were gathering, and the throne of Valmark stood open for the one lawful heir left alive. It said, "Come home." It said, "The tide has turned." It said, "You are needed, Highness, and the waiting is over." A poorer man would have run for the coast that same hour. A wiser man, perhaps, there was nothing left for him at Harrowgate but insult and a docked wage and a cold bed above the horses. He had every reason in the world to go. He stayed. He stayed because of a girl and a piece of music and a promise he had made at a pianoforte. The ball was 10 days off. He had told Clara he would teach her the thing that might let her be seen, and the thing was not yet learned. And he knew, this is the part that matters, he knew that to stay, to be in that drawing-room when the great guests came, was to risk everything. For the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar was coming, and the Dowager Duchess had spent her girlhood at a court 1,000 miles away, in a white palace above a river, listening to a certain waltz. He knew she might know him. He knew what one word from her could undo. And he stayed anyway, because a man who has lost a kingdom learns the exact worth of the few who were kind to him when he had nothing, and he will not trade them for his own safety, not this one. So in the small hours, alone, he did a careful thing. He took a needle. He unpicked the seam in the lining of his single black coat, the seam Clara had mended so neatly last winter, and he drew out the hard little object she had felt with her fingers and never named. It was not a coin. For one moment in the candlelight it caught the flame and threw it back. Gold, worked gold. A ring too heavy and too old for any tutor's hand, cut deep with a crest of a falcon and a crown. He held it a moment. His whole country was in that little band of gold. Then he wrapped it in a scrap of cloth and sewed it back into the dark, exactly where it had been, and put the coat on, and went to teach a piano lesson. The 10 days went by like water. Clara learned her piece. It was a small thing, a nocturne he wrote out for her by hand in the empty music room in the failing light, and it was not showy, and it had no thunder in it. But it was hers. He drilled her until her fingers knew it in the dark. Not for them, he told her once, when she faltered and grew afraid. Play it for yourself. Let them listen if they like, and she found, to her own astonishment, that when she stopped playing for their approval, she played better than she had ever played in her life. The house, meanwhile, spun itself into a fever. 40 guests were coming. The whole future of Harrowgate turned on a single night. Lady Farleigh had 60 days to find £9,300, and only one way to find it. And that way was Lord Bramwell's ring on Augusta's finger before the debt came due. Every candle, every ribbon, every hired footman was bent to that one purpose. Augusta was to shine. Augusta was to conquer. And the ruined old drawing-room, scrubbed and gilded and hung with the last good silver, was to be the field where the Farleighs won back their fortune. The morning of the ball, Augusta found Clara on the back stairs and looked her up and down, at the plain grey gown that was the best Clara owned, the only gown she owned fit to be seen in. "You are not seriously meaning to come down in that," Augusta said. "You'll shame us. You look like a governess who has been left out in the rain." And the maids laughed, because it was safe to laugh at Clara, and Clara said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and she went up to her cold little room and sat on the bed, and did not cry, because she had long ago run out of the habit of it. The music master found her there. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "You will come down," he said. "You will play the piece, and you will hold your head as though you owned the house." He paused. "Because there is more of a lady in you than in every guest that will walk through that door tonight. I have known ladies, Miss Ainsworth. I know what I am looking at." She did not understand what he meant. She thought it a kindness, a poor man's kindness, worth little in the coin of the world. She could not have guessed that a man who had bowed before archduchesses was telling her the plain truth as he saw it. The guests came at dusk. The carriages came up the long drive with their lamps lit, and the great doors were thrown open, and Harrowgate Hall put on. For one night the face of a house that was not drowning in debt. Lady Farleigh received them at the foot of the stairs in grey silk and cold diamonds. Augusta stood beside her, gold-haired, radiant, terrible, and Lord Bramwell bent over her hand and did not let it go a moment too soon, and Lady Farleigh watched him do it with the eyes of a woman counting money, and in the corner, by the pianoforte, in his single black coat with its mended lining, stood the music master, waiting to be told to play. Keller, Lady Farleigh, did not look at him. She never looked at him. "You will play through the dancing, something soft to begin, and you will not stop until you are told. Do you understand me?" "Yes, my lady," said the exiled Prince of Valmark, and sat down at the instrument and began very softly to play. Clara stood in the shadowed doorway at the far end of the room, where a poor relation stands, half in and half out, belonging to neither the servants nor the guests. She watched him play. She watched the great room fill with silk and candlelight and the low roar of 40 people who had never once gone hungry, and she waited for her name to be called, though she half believed it never would be. Then the last carriage came up the drive. A footman appeared at the door, white-faced, and half ran to Lady Farleigh, and whispered, and Lady Farleigh's hand went to her throat. "The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar," the footman announced, and the whole room turned as one toward the door, for the Duchess of Ravenscar was the greatest lady any of them would see in their lives, the guest of honour, the crown of the whole evening, 70 years old and straight as a blade, and worth more than every other soul in the room combined. She came in slowly, leaning on a stick of black ebony, in dove grey and old lace, with an old woman's sharp and patient eyes. Lady Farleigh swept toward her in the deepest curtsy she owned. Augusta curtsied. The whole room bent like wheat, and the Duchess did not see any of them, because at the far side of the room, in the corner by the pianoforte, a shabby foreign music master was playing a waltz, a sad and turning waltz, a waltz that climbed and fell and climbed again, that had a grief in it and a country in it that the Duchess of Ravenscar had not heard in 50 years, not since she was a girl of 20 in a white palace above a river, dancing under the eyes of a king. She stopped dead in the middle of the floor. The stick fell from her hand. It clattered on the polished boards, and the sound of it was very loud, because the room had gone silent, watching the greatest lady in the county stand frozen and grey faced in the middle of a dance she had come to grace. "That waltz," she said. Her voice shook. "Who taught you that waltz?" The music master's hands did not stop. He looked up from the keys, and he met her eyes across the whole length of the room, and something passed between them that none of the others could read. "No one taught it to me, madam," he said quietly. "I wrote it." The Duchess made a sound. It was not a word. She began to walk toward him, straight through the middle of the dancers, who fell back out of her way in confusion, and she left her fallen stick where it lay, and she did not need it, because she had forgotten she was old. She crossed the whole vast room. She came to the pianoforte and stopped, and she looked down into the face of the man they paid 9 shillings a week, and the last of the colour went out of her. "I know your face," she whispered. "God have mercy. I danced to that waltz the night your father was crowned. I held you when you were christened. I would know your face at the bottom of the sea." And then the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar, before 40 of the finest people in Yorkshire, gathered up her dove grey skirts and sank down onto the polished floor of the Harrowgate drawing-room, into a full and formal court reverence, her old knees on the boards, her head bowed, before a penniless music master. The room did not breathe. "He is Anton IV," she said, and her voice carried now, clear and ringing and furious, into every corner of that silent room. "By the grace of God, sovereign Prince of Valmark, the lawful heir to a throne older than this whole kingdom of yours. And this house," here she lifted her head and swept her terrible old eyes across Lady Farleigh, across Augusta, across all of them, "this house has made him play for his bread in the corner like a hired fiddler. Rise, Highness, I beg you. This floor is not fit for the honour of your knee." Nobody moved. Nobody could. Lady Farleigh stood with her mouth open and no sound coming out of it. Augusta had gone white to the lips, and in the shadowed doorway Clara Ainsworth put her hand against the frame to hold herself up, because the room had begun to tilt, because the poor foreign man who had taught her for nothing who had mended words back into her that the household had torn out, was a prince, and she had felt his crown with her own fingers and mended it into the dark without ever knowing. The music master rose from the pianoforte, and as he rose the whole bearing of him changed, though he did nothing, though he only stood. The stoop went out of his shoulders, the care went out of his face. The man who had bowed his head at every insult for 6 months lifted it now, and it was the head of a king, and every soul in that room saw it and could never again unsee it. He crossed to the old Duchess and took her hands and raised her gently to her feet. "Madam," he said, and there were tears standing in his eyes now, "you kept faith. After 50 years, you kept faith. There are not 3 people left in the world who would have known me. I would know you in my grave," she said fiercely, gripping his hands. Then Anton reached up to the collar of his single black coat, and with his fingers he found the seam of the lining, the seam Clara had mended, and he tore it, and he drew out the hard little object she had felt with her own hand a winter ago and never named. He held it up. Gold, in the candlelight, worked gold, deep cut, a falcon and a crown. The Duchess took one look at it and her breath went out of her. "The signet of Valmark," she said. "The falcon of the house of Anton. The crown of 9 points. I have seen it 100 times on the king's own hand." She looked up at him, wondering. "You carried it. All these years. Through everything. It was all I brought out," said the prince. "It was all there was left to bring." And now the room began to move. It began to bow. Not all at once, it came in a ragged, stumbling wave, this lord and then that lady, sinking into curtsies and reverences all across the great room, 40 people who an hour ago would not have given the music master the time of day, folding themselves down now before the falcon and the crown. It moved through the room like wind through a field. Lord Bramwell moved fastest of all. He had been standing at Augusta's very elbow, her all but betrothed, her family's whole salvation, and now he stepped away from her, stepped clean away, so that a cold foot of empty air opened between them, and he crossed to the prince and bowed so low his nose near touched his knee. "Your Highness," he said, breathless, oily, quick, "Your Highness, what an honour, what an unspeakable honour. Had I but known, I am entirely at your service, entirely, you must let me." Anton looked at him. It was a long, quiet look. Then he said, in a voice dry as old paper, "You were, I think, engaged a moment ago. To the lady behind you. You appear to have mislaid her." And he turned his shoulder to Bramwell, and that was all, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Every soul in the room had seen the man leap from a sinking girl to a rising prince in the space of 3 seconds, and no one in that county would ever look at Lord Bramwell the same way again. He had exposed himself more completely in one blow than an enemy could have done in a year. Augusta stood quite alone in the middle of the floor. The gold-haired conqueror, the queen of the evening, the girl who was to save the house, abandoned, in front of everyone, by the man she had been made to catch. She reached out one hand toward the prince. "Your Highness," she began, in the sweet high voice that had always got her everything. I am sure I always felt there was something noble in. He did not hear her. That was the cruelty of it, and it was a just cruelty. He simply did not see her. His eyes had already gone past her gold hair and her fine gown, past all of it, to the shadowed doorway at the end of the room, where a girl in a plain grey dress stood white and trembling and trying to make herself small. "Miss Ainsworth," said the Prince of Valmark. The whole room turned to look where he was looking. 40 faces, and every one of them puzzled, because who was Miss Ainsworth, the poor relation, the drudge, the girl below the salt? What could the prince want with her? "Miss Ainsworth," he said again, and he held out his hand toward her across the whole length of the room. "Will you come here to me?" And Clara, on legs that hardly held her, came out of the shadow and into the light. She walked the length of that drawing-room with 40 pairs of eyes upon her, past Lady Farleigh, past Augusta, past all the silk and the diamonds, in her plain grey gown, and she did not stumble, because somewhere in the last 6 months a man had taught her how to hold her head. She came to him, and he took her hand, and he turned with her to face the room, and he did not raise his voice, because a prince does not need to. When I came to this house, he said, I was nobody. I was a foreign man with a torn coat and an empty purse, and this household fed me in the passage and mocked my speech and docked my wage for the crime of correcting a wrong note. You all know it is true. You watched it, and you laughed. He let that sit. Nobody laughed now. One person in this house treated me as a man. One, this lady. She mended my coat when it was falling from my back, and asked nothing. She sat and learned from me because I had one thing left to give that no one could dock or steal, and she took it as a gift and gave me back my dignity without ever knowing what I was. His hand tightened on hers. She mended the crown of Valmark into my coat with her own fingers and never knew, and she was kind to me when kindness cost her, and bought her nothing and could never be repaid. That is the only rank I have learned to honour. So I will tell you what I told her this morning, when she thought herself too poor to come downstairs. She is the only lady of true quality in this house, and I would be glad before all of you if she would allow me the honour of her hand for the first dance. Clara could not speak. Her eyes had filled. She managed to nod, only that, and the Prince of Valmark bowed over her hand as low as any man in that room had ever bowed to Augusta, and led her out into the middle of the floor where an hour ago she had not dared to stand. The old Duchess picked up her fallen stick and struck it once hard upon the boards. Well, she barked at the frozen musicians in the gallery. You heard His Highness. A waltz. And they played, and the prince danced with the wallflower in the exact spot on the floor where, not 2 seasons past, Augusta had struck a cup of water from her hands. The doors opened again while they danced. A footman, stammering, announced men who had not been invited, foreign men, travel-stained, in dark cloaks, led by a grey, bearded lord with a hard soldier's face. He came into the room, and his eyes found Anton across the dancing, and he stopped, and his hard face broke, and he crossed to the prince and went down on one knee. Highness, he said, Count Voss, I have ridden from the coast without sleeping. His voice cracked. It is done. The regent is dead these 10 days. The usurper's men have laid down their arms. Valmark is yours, the throne stands open and lawful and waiting, and there is not a hand raised against you in the whole country. We have come to take you home to be crowned. The prince stood very still, with Clara's hand in his, and the tutor they had starved in the passage, the foreign man they paid 9 shillings a week, the beggar with a fiddle they made stand in the corner, by the word of a loyal soldier on his knee, before 40 witnesses, became a reigning king. Lady Farleigh found her voice at last. It came out thin and cracked and desperate. But he is only the music tutor, she said. He is only Keller. I hired him myself. At 9 shillings, he is nobody, he is. The silence that answered her was the worst sound in the room. Nobody looked at her. Nobody argued. They only stood, and let her words hang there in the air, small and ugly, until she heard them herself. It was Count Voss who turned to her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something on his shoe. You will address His Majesty, he said coldly, as Your Majesty, if he permits you to address him at all. Which, madam, were I in his place, I should not. Lady Farleigh sat down. Her legs simply stopped holding her, and she sat down on a little gilt chair and did not get up again for a long time. The prince was as good as his word, and better. In the days that followed, when the county could talk of nothing else, he settled the one piece of business that the ruined house could not settle for itself. He sent for Mr. Crane of Ledbury and Crane, and the banker came bowing and scraping to a king, and the debt of £9,300 was paid in full from the prince's own restored purse. He did not do it as a mercy to Lady Farleigh. He said as much plainly in front of her. "I do not do this for you, madam," he told her. "I do it because there are servants under this roof who would lose their place and their bread if the house fell, and they were kind to me when you were not. The stable boy I taught his letters. The girl in the scullery you would have turned out in the snow, whom I saw you would have turned out, and did not let you. They keep their roof because of them. Not you. Remember it." And the stable boy, a lad of 13 who could now read, was brought before the king, and given a place and a wage, and the scullery maid the prince had once quietly shielded from Augusta's temper was given the same. The kindnesses he had scattered in his months of poverty came back now and stood up in the light, and were named, and were rewarded, every one. Augusta married, in the end. Not a lord. The debt was paid, but the fortune was gone all the same, and a girl with no dowry, and a ruined name, and a story told against her in every drawing-room in the county cannot be so choosing as she once was. She married a curate, a mild and dull young man with £40 a year, and went to live in a small damp house in a small grey parish, and was not cruel to anyone any more, because she no longer had the power to be. Lord Bramwell, who had leapt so nimbly from the sinking girl to the rising prince, found that the whole county had seen him do it, and was received nowhere, and at last went abroad, where they did not yet know the story. And Lady Farleigh, this is the smallest and the truest thing of all, Lady Farleigh, in the years that came after, when she told the tale to guests, as she often did, for it was the one interesting thing that had ever happened to her, always told it a little differently than it had been. In her telling, she had seen it. In her telling, she had always known. There was breeding in that man, she would say, over her tea, to whoever would listen. I saw it the moment he crossed my threshold. I said to Augusta at the time, "Did I not, Augusta?" I said, "That is no common tutor. One can always tell good blood." And no one who had been there ever contradicted her, because it was not worth the breath, and because there is no cure for a woman like that, and never was. 1 year later, in a white palace above a river, in a country 1,000 miles from Yorkshire, there was a garden. It hung above the water on an old grey terrace, and the roses had been let grow wild, and in the warm of the late afternoon the light came down gold and easy through the leaves. There was a pianoforte carried out onto the terrace, because the Queen liked to play in the open air, where she could hear the river underneath the music. Clara sat at it, for it was Clara, of course it was Clara, the prince had married the girl who mended his coat, and made her his consort before the whole of his restored court, and there was not a soul in Valmark who did not love her, for the story of the wallflower and the exiled king had gone into that country like a song. Beside her on the bench sat a small dark village child, 7 or 8 years old, with ink on her fingers and her legs too short to reach the pedals, and Clara was teaching her, note by patient note, the very piece a poor music master had once written out by hand in a failing English light. The nocturne, the small, quiet piece with no thunder in it. "Play it for yourself," Clara told the child. "Let them listen if they like." The prince stood at the edge of the terrace with his back to the palace and his face to the river, and he listened to his wife teach a poor child the tune that had once let her be seen. And he was quiet, because he was always quiet, and he was content, which he had not been in 15 years. The anthem was played properly now. It was played by full orchestras, on great occasions, under the falcon and the crown. But he thought sometimes that it had never sounded so true as it had that night in a cold Yorkshire drawing-room, played soft in a corner by a man in a torn coat, for a room full of people who did not know they were listening to a king. He had learned one thing in all of it that he had not known before. He had learned it from a girl in a grey gown who had no reason on earth to be kind to a stranger, and was kind anyway, It was this: the ones who look closest at the least of us, who bother to see the man behind the shabby coat, who mend what is torn without asking what it is worth, those are the ones worth raising. Those are the only true nobility there is. Everything else is only gold, and gold can be sewn into a lining and forgotten, and it changes nothing at all. So if you have ever been the one in the corner, if you have ever been fed in the passage, seated below the salt, looked past and counted cheap by people who should have looked closer, remember the music tutor they thought a penniless miger. Remember that the truest thing about a person is almost never the thing they wear on the outside. And remember the girl who mended the coat and never knew she was mending a crown. I want to know where this story found you tonight. So do me one kindness before you go. Comment the city you are watching from. I would like to see how far this little story has travelled from that cold room in Yorkshire out into all the corners of the world.